And Karen always goes to the wrong Zoom. I have no idea why.
It's because that other event never gets canceled, because I did that myself today and I thought I sent out the wrong link.
Okay.
Welcome everyone. We're just waiting on folks to hop in here. Thanks for joining.
We're just going to wait a minute or two more till everyone gets in here.
As Kim said, as people are rolling in, if you guys could do us a favor and update your name on Zoom to be kind of your name and your affiliation. It looks like most of you have that. It's just helpful for us to know and note who was able to make the call today. If you don't know how to do that, you just right-click the name on your screen and click rename. Thought you were invisible for a second, Kirk.
Nope, can't get rid of me.
Good to see you. Let's just give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Great. Well, I think we have the majority here, so just to respect everybody's time, we can get started. We were just saying before you all hopped on that it feels like it's been a really long time since we've seen you all, so it's great to see everybody's faces. So today is an exciting day. The first, it will be a little bit more presentation heavy. We'll leave room for Q&A and discussion, but just know that it is a little bit more presentation heavy than in past meetings. So preparing yourself for that a little bit. So as always, we'll start with introductions. So today we thought we would state our name, affiliation, and then something you are looking forward to in 2022, because it is 2022, which is crazy. I think I accidentally said 2020 the other day, and I was like, are we just losing years now? I don't know. So I'll just go around my screen. So again, Diane Ernst with Lotus Engineering and Sustainability. Good to see everybody. Most looking forward to in 2022, I recently became an aunt. So just my little nephew is the cutest and he'll be 1 this year. So just very excited to continue watching him grow up. Let's start with the state team. So Kim and Crystal, if you guys could introduce yourselves.
Yep, Kim Burke from the Colorado Energy Office. Nice to see everyone again. In 2022, I'm looking forward to taking a vacation to Hawaii next month. We've already done COVID here in our household, so we're good. Got over it. So we are good to go. But can we also make an announcement about Julia?
Oh yeah, I was like, I wasn't sure. So yeah, Julia, who you normally see at these meetings with Lotus, she did have her baby. She had a little baby girl. She was only 1 day past her due date. So she's at home becoming a new mom, which is very exciting. We'll miss her, but we'll introduce some other folks on the Lotus team. But yeah, great news in 2022.
Yes. I'll pass it over to Crystal now.
Thanks, Kim.
Hi, everyone. I'm Crystal Agelkamp. I'm the Benchmarking Program Associate with the state. And one thing I'm looking forward to is, I hate to say this because I know Colorado is a winter state, but I'm looking forward to spring and seeing the wildflowers. I know I have a couple months for that, but looking forward to some warmer weather.
Yeah, at least the sun's been out the past couple of days. That's helpful. So there's some new faces from the Lotus team here. So Hillary, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I actually feel like I've met a lot of the people that are on the call already, but my name is Hillary Dobosh, and I'm one of the co-owners of Lotus. And I'll be presenting a little bit on data, but also here just to generally support the process. But I'm really excited to be here today. And so I'll pass it on to Kim, who's new to our team.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. My name is Kim Schlepfer. I'm the Senior Associate for Climate Mitigation and Resilience Planning with Lotus. I started a few weeks ago, and as Hillary said, I'll be here supporting the remainder of this project. So thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Thanks, Kim. And then we have some other folks today that will be supporting this effort from originally Overlay, now called Touchstone IQ. So it looks like we have Jessica and Kelsey here. So Jessica, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, know a lot of you already. Good to see the rest of you and meet you today. My name is Jessica. I'm a program manager with Touchstone IQ, working with Colorado Energy Office on developing the benchmarking program, implementing and running it for the state. So here to present today on the covered buildings list, get you guys some more context there on the data. It sounds like you'll be hearing a bit more on today as well. And looking forward to a lot of outdoor time in 2022.
Good one. And Kelsey.
Hi, my name is Kelsey. I work with Touchstone IQ. I'm an energy and sustainability consultant, and I assisted with developing the covered building list for the state program. And I'm looking forward to doing some backpacking this summer.
Fun. You guys are getting me excited for summer now, and it's still winter. Oh, that's great. Thanks. And we're also thrilled to introduce Laura Dias with Group 14. A little bit later in the agenda, she'll go over kind of how Group 14 is going to support this effort, but very, very excited to get them on board. So Laura, I'll have you introduce yourself.
Yeah, like Diane said, Laura Dias with Group 14. Excited to be joining you guys. And I am currently calling in from Napa, so enjoying my first vacation of 2022 and first vacation in a long time. So
fun. Well, thanks for calling in. Great. All right. So I'll just go around my screen here. I'll start with you, Bill.
Hi, Bill Green with the RMH Group, representing American Council of Engineering Companies. I'm a mechanical engineer, 40 years building experience, and I am looking forward to vacation in Cabo. We've canceled about 3 times, so.
I know, I've been hearing that a lot. Great, glad you get to go. John?
Hi, John Lauer with Newmark. I think the thing I'm looking forward to, it's a long shot, but the cruise industry getting back to some kind of normalcy. I miss it.
Fingers crossed. Great, Cecil?
Hi, everybody. Cecil Courtney, Pipe Fitters Local 208. Looking forward to spending a lot more time off-roading with my family up in the mountains.
Fun, good one. Maria.
Hi everyone, Maria with Iconergy. I'm speaking through my phone, but my video is also on separately on my computer, so it might be a little confusing, but I am most looking forward to continuing exploring outdoors during the winter. I've been doing a lot of snowshoeing and just hiking in the snow, which is something new for me. So I'm trying to enjoy this winter weather and be grateful for the snow that we finally have.
Great, thanks, Maria. Kate.
Hello, this is Kate Townley from CDPHE, and I work as a built environment specialist. And like Bill, I just rebooked a trip to Mexico. So fingers crossed, I'll be heading to the beach soon.
Oh, I love it. Karen.
Hi, everybody. Karen Hancock from City of Aurora, and I'm in the middle of a kitchen project, completely reconstruction. I don't have any power today. So I'll be really glad when I have a kitchen and power and no mess. So thanks.
That is important. Kirk.
Hi, everyone. Kirk Longstein, Fort Collins Utilities. Happy to be here. Happy to see everybody. I'll continue on the travel theme. I'm really excited. I just booked a float trip up in Alaska outside of Denali. So getting excited for that already.
I should just be writing my bucket list as you guys are talking. That's great. Thanks, Kurt. Christine.
Hi, Christine Brinker at Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. We wrapped up last year by getting rear-ended and getting our old Subaru completely totaled. So in this year, I'm looking forward to getting an electric car. So we hope to get one eventually, but it's now accelerated.
Good motivation, though. Thanks, Christine. Kara.
Hi, good to see everyone. Kara Carmichael from RMI. I'm looking forward to a trip we have planned down to Lake Powell before it goes away, potentially. But also just wanted to acknowledge the great work from this team and the importance of what we're all doing in light of the recent announcement last Friday with the White House around the Building Performance Coalition. I think it's really exciting, really important, and I'm proud to be part of this work. So thanks.
Thanks, Kara. Michael?
I'm Michael Gifford, AGC Colorado, Associated General Contractors. As a reminder, is commercial building general contractors, specialty contractors, and suppliers. And I feel very fortunate to work with them as their CEO, and I am going to do the whole list. I just heard, starting probably with the rafting trip, and then snowshoeing, and then I want to go with Bill Green very bad to Cancun, but we're both task force members, so we can't go to the same place at the same time. So you just leave some breadcrumbs and I'll follow behind you.
I like it. Next on my screen is CF Clark with CDPHE.
Hi, everyone. I'm Clay Clark. I'm the supervisor of the climate program at CDPHE. So we're working on rulemaking on lots of different fronts. So I haven't been able to join so many of these meetings, but Kate is our designee that already introduced herself. So I'll be joining when I can, but Kate will be joining, I think, for most of these meetings. So I recently, with my wife and kids, moved to Golden from Denver. So sort of for the year, sort of looking forward to exploring the new neighborhood and sort of fitting in. But all these vacation ideas have got me thinking. So maybe we should take a break from the moving and take a trip somewhere.
There you go. Thanks for being here, Clay. Nori?
I'm Nari Boyd, work with the Boulder County Housing Authority. Yeah, your trip sounds awesome. I am excited just about live music, like a big, loud stuff, beer spilled all over you, loud music. That's what I'm looking forward to all spring and summer.
That sounds fun. Joel?
Joel Danforth, United Power. I'm going to talk about what's exciting about work. We're planning on launching a residential smart charging program for EVs this year. So I'm really excited about that. We already lead the state in per capita rooftop solar and looking forward to claiming that mantle for EVs as well.
That's great, Joel. Thanks. Maybe next meeting we'll do work sharing. I think I love it. That's great. Bill Martin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bill Martin, Centura Health, and I'm looking forward to the day when Zoom meetings aren't stacked up behind one another all day long, and give us at least 15 minutes in between these darn meetings, please. That's all I ask for this coming year. Thank you.
I hear you on that. Katrina.
Hi, everyone. Katrina Mann again with the Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And I'm still looking forward to ski season. I feel like the good snow is just getting started. I have a couple long weekends planned and lots of short day trips and fun times out with my 5-year-old playing in the snow.
Fun. Will?
Will Tour, Director of the Colorado Energy Office. And I'm looking forward both to the backcountry ski season, which has already started. It's been good for about 3 weeks now. And to an exciting legislative session where hopefully we'll get about $500 million allocated to climate and air quality projects.
Great. That sounds wonderful. Stacy.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm Stacy Bumgarn. I'm at Colorado State University. Just got a new sleeping bag, so it'd be really awesome in 2022 to take it somewhere outside of the living room, say, right? You know, should expand the horizons a little bit.
Yes, fingers crossed. Josh.
Hello, everybody. Josh Korth with CDPHE, assisting with Kate and Clay as available. Currently in the technical support and SIP development unit, so we've got a heck of a lot of ozone stuff coming up here this year, but still working on clean energy plans, clean heat plans, and all the overlap that this task force has with those various activities.
Thanks, Josh.
And I guess I'm looking forward to just getting out with my boys and doing something.
Anything, right? Getting out of the house.
Exactly.
Thanks, Josh. Tracy. Oh, sorry, you're muted, Tracy.
All right, Tracy Phillips, I'm with the Colorado CPACE program. We help finance energy efficiency, renewable energy, and water conservation projects across the state. And I'm looking forward to the Avalanche winning the Stanley Cup. They've been killing it.
I forget about sports. I'm a Green Bay Packer fan, so I'm just out now for the next few months.
Yeah, I share your pain as well.
Yeah, thank you. Great. All right. Well, let's dive right in. I'll share my screen and we can go over what we're hoping to accomplish today. Let me pull this up. Swap. Does that look good? Great.
Yes. Yep.
Thanks. Perfect. All right. So today's outcomes, what we're hoping to get across to everyone today is we will be discussing more in depth the public engagement process. There's been some great questions on, how do we get feedback from people outside of this group? So we'll be discussing the process for that today. We'll also have some great presentations to help you all understand the baseline conditions for buildings in Colorado and how this informs the BPS policy. And finally, we're going to maybe not so much gather input, we'll see how much time we have, but we will be presenting on compliance pathways regarding energy efficiency so that we can dive into compliance pathways for the next couple of meetings. So we'll start by discussing public engagement. We'll have Jessica from Overlay present on the covered building, Touchstone IQ present on the covered buildings list. So she'll have about a 10-minute presentation and we will leave time for Q&A as well. We're going to have Lotus, Hillary from Lotus present on the benchmarking data. She'll have about a 20-minute presentation and we will provide ample time for Q&A there. So those two will be kind of a lot to digest, take in information, but we will leave plenty of room for Q&A. And then we will take a break because as we heard, there's lots of Zoom meetings going on. So we will take a break to digest all that great information. And then we'll come back and present about some energy efficiency compliance pathways that we can learn about to consider for the statewide BPS. As always, just our meeting norms. So if possible, leaving cameras on and muting when not speaking. Knowing that this is a safe space, there's no bad ideas and all ideas will be considered. So please feel free to speak freely. Share your thoughts, but also share the space. There's a lot of great expertise and opinions in this room. So whether you're sharing your ideas verbally or in the chat, we welcome all ideas. Be respectful, be present, leverage your expertise, not your position or connections. And finally, consider all viewpoints, including those outside of this space. To give the overview of what we're all here to do today, work towards today, we won't figure all this out today, but what we're working towards is developing a building performance standard that is equitable, low carbon, and clean energy, that will reduce emissions sector-wide 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030. And we're aiming to develop a process for tracking that will reduce greenhouse gases, lower energy costs, and improve indoor air quality. So what have we done so far? So we've agreed on the statutory interpretation. We've agreed on guiding goals for equity, workforce, informing the community, ensuring reliability, and managing costs. We will be confirming the final guiding goal around a streamlined process today. We've also agreed that the base metric we will use for the statewide BPS is site EUI, and we've agreed that there will be additional alternative metrics available for certain buildings or situations. An overview of what's coming up. So after today, after we provide a lot of great data and information today, we'll dive into compliance pathways. So we'll focus mostly on efficiency at the next meeting, and then we'll dive into compliance pathways for renewable energy, electrification, and other potential compliance pathways. Right after March is when public engagement will start as well. So we'll have a lot of great data and information to help us make decisions. So note that that's coming, but the meeting in April will focus on workforce and equity considerations. In May, we'll discuss programs to support compliance. June, we'll review and discuss draft recommendations. And then in July, we will be voting and reviewing to confirm those recommendations. So back to our guiding goals. So we did confirm most of our goals to date, which is great. The one that we left from the last meeting was a guiding goal around a streamlined process. And so we did have some great discussion on Monday.com around these last two bullets that I want to definitely discuss today. But I will go over these first four bullets and maybe we can confirm those before we get into discussion on the last two bullets. So for the statewide BPS, for it to be a streamlined process, we are wanting to ensure all requirements and targets are within the control of the building owner, and there is consistency on how the BPS is rolled out for different building types. We also want to reduce the administrative burden to building owners for documenting compliance. We want to focus on lower performing buildings and coordinate and collaborate with local programs, including Denver BPS, to avoid duplicate compliance and reporting requirements. So how does this group feel about those first initial bullet points on a streamlined process? Go ahead, Stacy. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry to be the one that I feel like I keep bringing this up, but this the last bullet of coordinate and collaborate with local programs, we say including Denver BPS. I don't have anything against Denver, but there are other places that have these too. So why can't it just say with local programs to avoid duplicative compliance and reporting requirements, period?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Does anyone oppose? Great. Should we keep local, or should we just say, keep it a little bit more general? Local? Okay, great. Perfect, thanks, Stacy. Any other thoughts on these first four bullets? Katrina.
And just one question, can you remind me what was the intent behind the first bullet? I think it was just intending to not include utility, things that are in the utilities control. Is that right?
That's a great question. It's been a long time. So if anyone in this group remembers, these all came from you all. So I'd love input from the task force on that first bullet.
I suppose I'm asking because a question came up with our building performance standard around what about buildings where the tenant owns many of the energy using systems or has control of those. At the end of the day, leases say that tenants have to comply with the law. So it may not be like sort of the building owner that always has direct control, but at the end of the day, if they are leasing a space, then the tenant has to comply with the law. And so I was just trying to remember, like, I feel like this needs a little clarification to make sure we're not trying to exclude buildings. And there's certain building types where this tends to be particularly true, where tenants have a lot of the control because at the end of the day, they still have to comply. I think this was meant for a different intent, though.
What was that?
And/or tenants.
Yeah.
Building owner and/or tenants.
Yeah.
This first, that was related to my question as well. So within the control of the building owner, does that relate to condoized or shared ownership as well? Because I think the intent is the building footprint and not that. I don't know how to reframe that, but it does get tied up with shared ownership in that regard.
Oh my goodness, sorry.
Yeah, and just for in our case, like condos are considered building. All the condo owners are building owners under Denver's BPS. But I guess that's why I'm trying to understand, like, what is this trying to get at? And maybe it would be almost easier to restate in a way where we're trying to exclude what I don't remember what we were trying to exclude here, right? Like, was it like not requiring something of buildings that has to be done by a utility? In which case, maybe we flip this. Otherwise, I guess I'm trying to understand, like, what is the value of this bullet?
Yeah, I echo those sentiments, Katrina, and I'm questioning whether or not we even need this bullet.
Thoughts on that from others? Okay. We will strike it for now.
I
And
guess, sorry, I guess I'd come back in to say I might kind of like the direction Katrina was leaning. I mean, or somewhere, I don't know. I think there's a really good intent behind this that we just, as she worded, you know, like it's something that building owner, occupants, tenants, whatever can do. It's that it's not incumbent on the utility, or it's not incumbent upon something. I mean, I think it's about being able to achieve the standards.
Stacy, are you thinking of something that would not be in control of a building owner? I'm just wondering if we have an example of something that would not be in control of the building owner.
One of the reasons we moved towards site EUI instead of greenhouse gas emissions was that the greenhouse gas intensity of the grid was beyond the control of building owners. And so I thought that that's what this bullet was related to in general. And I don't see any harm in having it like it is. I would probably end it at tenants though, because different building types will have different ways that the program is rolled out, different ways of reaching them, different ways of helping them out.
That's a great point.
That makes sense to me. I'm fine either way.
Well, I think we've talked about this, and one of the issues is a significant portion of the building energy is plug load from the tenants. And yet it's the owner that is required to comply. And I don't know that a tenant is necessarily required to comply. So I think this was leaning towards, we got to set it up so that the owner can achieve the goals, but how do we do that?
I guess that's what I wanted to double check, is that wasn't our intent, right? Because in Denver, we settled on what I think was pretty reasonable, that tenants, they're part of an owner's strategy to comply. They are part of their energy users. Sometimes they own many of the systems through plug load, or all of the systems if they own, for example, the HVAC equipment in a warehouse. And the tenant will need to be a partner with the owner in complying with the law. Leases say they have to comply with laws. And so I wanted to make sure this actually wasn't excluding tenant action in the way it's worded, because I think it's necessary and reasonable to ask that tenants participate in this. In Denver, we have our smart leasing program to help align in leasing language those owner and tenant interests. But at the end of the day, leases say tenants have to follow the law and work with owners on things like this.
Yeah, great point, Katrina. Nori?
Yeah, I think that for commercial buildings, owner, operator, and tenant has one meaning. And then for like a large residential, as a housing authority, we wouldn't pass this on to our quote unquote residential tenants. And so if we're going to use the word tenant, because I get that it makes sense for the commercial buildings, then does it make sense to say commercial tenant as opposed to, I would never pass this on to Mrs. So-and-so in unit, whatever, in the housing authority buildings. And I don't want it to come across that tenants are going to bear that responsibility. It's up to me as an owner to convince the tenants and help educate them on energy saving measures that we're trying to achieve through electrification, but I wouldn't make them responsible. I'm still the building owner, or I'm going to hire an operator. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks.
So go ahead, Karen.
And I was just, Nori brought up a good point, and we have a lot of the multifamily buildings that would qualify for this program in Aurora. And I just wondered about leasing, when you lease to somebody, are there exclusions because the owner operator can't meet their targets if people use certain kinds of equipment, gas space heaters, I don't know, that kind of thing. I was just wondering if that would be something that would be within the owner's control to make it a lease term. If anybody could comment on that.
Any comments?
I think they could. I don't think it would be common. I think if a building owner wanted to address plug loads inside a unit, they'd probably ideally wait until the tenants had moved out, like in between leasing to one family versus another, and use that opportunity to upgrade the lighting or put in Energy Star appliances or something like that. So I think they can put in the lease requirement that. I don't think it would do any good, because they're not going to go in and inspect to see if anyone plugged in a little space heater or not.
Does that help, Karen?
I think how it's written is broad enough to get at what everyone is saying. And also, since this is more of a guiding principle rather than the law, we probably don't need to wordsmith it to death.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I think you're right. And we are taking great notes too. So if we see any, based on your comments now, we can edit, do some final edits. I want to just quickly, because I want to acknowledge the folks that made some comments on Monday.com. So I think for these last two, this include flexibility within interim periods and stringency towards the 2030 deadline. There was a great comment about having interim BPS targets other than the 2026 and 2030, unless those interim BPS targets are strictly voluntary. And there was a note that saying, we're looking for the maximum efficiency and least possible resistance, which is, if you're adding, a bunch of interim targets, that's more cumbersome and things like that. So making that more clear that we're not talking about flexibility in adding more interim targets, but that it's that's still, we're not adding more interim targets. So is there a way to make that more clear? And there were a couple of folks on Monday.com that made those comments. Feel free to chime in if I didn't get across what you were getting at.
So I think I made one of those comments. Yeah, and my perspective is that if we are going to impose a 2025 deadline or a 2029 deadline, say, I don't know, 18% by 2029, I think those should be voluntary, and we should let the law be the law for 2026 and 2030.
Does that make sense to everybody? Any thoughts on that? Katrina, did you have
I was wondering if there's an edit that you're proposing to this.
No, I think just
then,
for sake of time, let's just get ideas out and we'll wordsmith these after the meeting today. So so we'll include wordsmithing that includes what Joel just said, unless there's opposition there.
I guess the way Denver's works is we have interim reporting dead compliance targets, and you have to maintain that performance level until the next target date. I guess I wouldn't want to see buildings comply in 2026 and then be allowed to do anything they want in terms of energy performance in 2027, 2028, 2029, and then have to only comply again in 2030. You sort of want folks to be maintaining that performance sort of for the sake of likelihood of success in 2030 also. So I think certainly that's not in line with Denver's policy, but I think it's a better policy to sort of, if we set like a 2026 target, say it has to be maintained in the subsequent years prior to 2030. So, but I think we can get into those details later. I guess that it just doesn't seem like necessarily the direction to go, but I think we've got a lot of other things to decide first.
No, Katrina, I think that makes a good point. Joel, do you agree with that piece that it's maintaining and great?
Yeah, certainly. I agree. I just don't want them. These are probably going to be pretty invasive projects. So to ask them to do an invasive project on a building each and every year to meet a new threshold, I think is asking a lot. We should give them time between performance periods to meet that next target without sliding backwards on the existing target. I agree with that.
Sounds good.
Great, perfect. And then this last bullet was a suggestion. So I just wanted to get the rest of the group's thoughts on this last bullet. Facilitate implementation of the law without adding, this could be just based off what we were just talking about, but facilitate implementation of the law without adding requirements of building owners beyond those outlined in the law to the extent practical. I think that's what you're getting at, Joel, right?
Yeah, this one was also my comment. My goal here is to minimize the amount of bureaucracy that the building owners have to go through in order to comply with this law. I think the law is pretty clearly written. There's some ambiguities that I think we are tasked with sorting out, but I think we should limit the scope of our reach as a governor-appointed committee to facilitating that law without adding unnecessarily to it. And those performance targets is one example of that.
Perfect. Thanks, Joel. And it's always important to consider, that piece of the burden on building owners. So I appreciate you bringing those up. I was just looking at Kirk's comment. I like that update. I think that's what you said.
It's an and statement.
Oh, and thanks. Oh gosh, all right, I'll fix that one. It doesn't like to copy and paste for me ever. Let's see. Okay, so focus on lower. Great. Perfect. Okay, so making these edits up top here and including the discussion we just had, can we just do a quick vote on at least we're moving in the right direction, and we can send a final goal statement for this after this meeting today?
Diana, just one change to that. If you could go back up on that Kara and on the fourth bullet, coordinate and collaborate with local and national programs. Can you just add and national after local? Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I'm just seeing some other comments too. Great. Okay, great. And then adding comments to here, and then this will kind of build off of this one. Great. I'm not as quick as wordsmithing as Julia was, but at least if we feel good about the conversation and that everyone's voices were heard, do we feel good about this final goal statement? If you could do your fist to 5, if you're a voting board member, that would be great. And Kim S will capture those. Thanks, Kathy. Great. It looks like we mostly got consensus. Joel will definitely follow up with you because I want to make sure we interpreted those last 2 bullets by what you mentioned today. So thank you. Great. All right. Well, thank you for those. So what we'll do is we'll wordsmith, send those back out, and then we'll put the final, excuse me, the final guiding goal statements on monday.com for everyone to look at one more time. Perfect. All right. We're going to move into here talking about the public engagement process. I will share my screen again. Great. So internally, we've developed a public engagement roadmap. And the purpose there is to for us to ensure that we're engaging the broader public so that we have support and buy-in for the final recommendations, and to ensure not just on the final recommendations, but that ensure public concerns and input are considered throughout the process. So we'll share in a little bit about how we'll ensure that their feedback is coming to this team before we make decisions, but that's the overall purpose of the public engagement roadmap. The audience is going to be a diverse group of stakeholders that may be impacted by the BPS, and we want to ensure that it goes from planners to implementers, building owners to tenants, and ensuring that we're getting everybody in between those. That's not a comprehensive list, but just noting that we want to ensure that a diverse group of stakeholders is engaged. And we did identify 3 audiences that we want to make sure we target in our public engagement process. And that is rural communities, workforce, and underrepresented communities. The level of engagement for them to help clarify what their role is versus the task force's role versus the state's role is we want to inform them of the process and involve them in obtaining their feedback. But in the end, this task force is tasked with taking their feedback and making recommendations. So just knowing that that is part of the process. So we'll be obtaining feedback, bringing that back to the task force, and the task force and the state are the ultimate decision makers in the end. And so how are you all going to be involved in obtaining the public's feedback? We really couldn't do this without all of you. I know each of you have great connections and networks. And so the way that we're hoping to make this a team effort is one, we'll be developing engagement materials for you all to send out to your different constituencies and communities. And we'll want to co-create that with you. I think you all will have great feedback on what questions we should be asking, how to best get the content in front of people and things like that. So in future meetings, we'll be co-creating those engagement materials with each of you. So we'll look for that. It's not required, but we will be hosting 3 facilitated public meetings with those 3 groups. So the rural communities, workforce, and underrepresented groups. So know that that is an option to sit in on and be a part of that. We also are hoping that you can help disseminate those outreach materials and engage your constituencies in the various outreach materials that we will be sharing with you. And some of those are going to potentially be a survey to be sent out to various people in your network. We thought about developing some sort of slide deck for you all to share. I know Bill Green has talked about presenting to different groups that he's a part of, and I think that's a great avenue to be able to do that. But we want to be able to ensure that you all are sharing consistent information and asking the same questions of these constituencies so that we're all coming back with the same, at least similar data set, so we can make decisions based off of those. And we will support you in many ways and hope to hear from you today about other ways we can support you. But we have developed a contact spreadsheet that we'll share after this meeting that you all will have an opportunity to fill in based on your networks and constituencies, so that we know that maybe Bill wants to contact one person and Stacy wants to contact another person, that we're not both contacting the same people. So this will help keep the effort aligned across task force members. We'll also be hosting those 3 facilitated public meetings, and we'll be developing outreach materials for each of you. And really, we want to provide you the support to involve and inform your constituencies throughout the process. And this can go beyond those 3 bullet points that I just shared about how we will support you. We can help with things like providing key language to share. We can provide, like I said, a slide deck or a copy that can be used on websites, social media, press releases, things like that, so that you have the tools that you need in order to go out to your communities and get the feedback that would help this group make some informed decisions. So the way that we've outlined that is we'll start by co-creating those engagement materials. So we're in January. So like I said, we'll send that context spreadsheet, and we'll be discussing today about what's to come. So that's our hope for this meeting. In February, we'll be developing a survey. So we'd love feedback on that survey. So you'll be kind of helping co-create questions to go into that survey. And then we'll be creating outreach materials, as I said in the previous slide. And we want to also create an approach to collect metrics. So I think it'll be helpful for us in the end to be able to say, how do we want to measure our efforts in this space so that we can ensure that we're reaching a diverse set of communities and things like that. In March, we'll be kind of asking you all to start going out and going to different communities. And Bill, as you mentioned, some of this might be happening in February and things like that. So we're not tied to this, but we want to make sure we have our ducks in a row before we do go out to different communities. And we'll be co-creating materials, and then we'll have you all be going out into your constituencies and asking for feedback. April is when we'll be kicking off those public meetings. May we'll wrap up the public meetings and continue with the survey and collecting engagement materials and metrics. And what I should have done is put this side by side with our efforts, because in April, we're discussing workforce and equity considerations. So our hope is that we have that feedback from these different communities prior to that meeting, so that we'll start our meeting on workforce and equity considerations with data and feedback from community members. And then moving into June and July, we'll be analyzing more of those survey results and engagements to help inform the draft BPS and the final BPS. So any questions on the process, any input on the process, or we are posing these 3 questions because it's really our hope at Lotus and with the state to really support you in this process. Because like I said, it is a team effort, and you all have great networks and things like that. So we want to ensure that we are supporting you in the best way possible to be able to go out to your communities. So any questions, thoughts?
Well, this K-Head meeting that I mentioned is February 8th
right.
At noon. And it's a quick lunch presentation of what does the legislation say. So I'm wondering if that's okay to do. I know I saw a great presentation that Christine Brinker did for her Energy Efficiency Business Coalition. I would expect to do kind of something like that.
Yeah, if you feel like it's more of like a high level overview, I think that we could get those materials over to you. And if Christine's willing to share, we can combine with our materials, and that is more than welcome to be happening in February. That sounds great.
Good.
And I just want to note, Stacy made a great point that we allow for some follow-up to, we did discuss this internally as well. So how do we kind of respond to outstanding questions from these stakeholder groups? So we're going to get feedback and then we can process that, and we might have additional questions and things we want to ensure we're bringing back to those communities. So I think that's critical. We also have discussed with the pertaining to equity and working with frontline community members, our intent there would be to get feedback from them, and maybe they come back with a way for us to kind of filter decision making so that as we make decisions, we ensure there's an equity lens incorporated on the decisions made within this team. And then the hope would be to go back and say, this is what we heard, this is what we decided, does this resonate with you? Because we want to be sure that we do that follow-up piece. I think that's critical. So thanks for bringing that up, Stacy. Great. Oh, go ahead, Stacy.
Yeah, I would just ask, as far as this tools that we need, I think about just really basic, what it is, a little backdrop of what that legislation is, how it's going to be implemented, how people comply, without a lot of lingo, without a lot of fancy terms and words, that's just really straightforward. Again, I'm thinking about some colleagues in higher ed across the state who've just said, what are we going to have to do? Right. Mm-hmm. So it's like really just that's a difficult question, but it's a simple question of like, what do they need to do? Mm-hmm. And so we don't need to get bogged down in all kinds of these gory details about how to measure greenhouse gas emissions. We just need to help folks understand what are the real basics that they need to do to be in compliance and on the path, and then trust the process.
Right. Great point, Stacy. And I think that's why we are holding off on extensive public engagement until April, because we want to be sure that we have our ducks in a row as a task force before we go out. And that doesn't mean that their feedback isn't going to change and alter some things, but at least we have that foundational piece before we go out so that we can answer those types of questions. I also want to note, based on your point, that we will also help tailor outreach materials to the groups you're meeting, because building owners might want to know something very different from a tenant, might be very different from XYZ. So we want to be sure that the materials that we're creating resonate with the audience as well. Nori.
That made me think about just recently we've had this horrifying fire in Boulder County that hit Superior, and luckily first responders were amazing, and everybody, most everybody got out, and there was very few loss of life, but just the devastation is incredible. And so if we, I do keep hearing about building officials and communications going out to the towns that were impacted with, yes, this is horrifying, your structures were wiped out, and how are we going to help you build back, meet modern building codes? And this is mainly, a lot of single family homes, There were a few commercial buildings, and probably, I don't know if any of them actually would qualify for this given the size, maybe a Target. But I'm sure they would have questions about, okay, this is a horrible opportunity and we want to make smart decisions now so that we get on the right foot with this legislation, and just having those high level talking points about here's an opportunity as opposed to here's your new compliance coming at you next year would be a nice way to be able to communicate out to this particular community that's been impacted by the fires.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. And but Christine Brinker with SWEEP and Lotus and even Laura with Group 14, we are working extensively in those communities on a separate project. So we'll already have some great connections and relationships, and we'll have kind of an understanding of where they're headed. They're all working on mostly building code updates and things like that. So I'm really, really glad you brought that up, because I think that ensuring that when we're coming to these communities, we're realistic with real life, understandings and things like that is critical. So thanks so much. Great point, Kara, too, on also adding funding resources. We'll keep an eye on that. We've been hearing things in our additional meetings on pieces there, so that'll be a good thing to compile in our outreach efforts. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat. Great points here. Thanks, Karen. Sounds great. Kim, can you speak to the timeline of when this task force has final recommendations, and then the timeline for compliance for building owners? And I'm just trying to get at Stacy's question.
Yes, sorry, I'm trying to read back to that. Right, so the task force recommendations will obviously be due October 1st of this year. Then they will go to actually Will Tour, the Colorado Energy Office, and he will pass them along to the Air Quality Control Commission, which will have a rulemaking. They need to do their rulemaking by June 1st of 2023. And obviously then the first compliance deadline isn't until 2026. Really, we won't know that data until 2027 when they actually submit their benchmarking report, which is the deadline is June 1st of 2027, in which we'll have calendar year 2026 energy data. So it will be several years in advance that they will have for that compliance timeline. Obviously, they need to start making, preparations now to figure out, how they're going to get there budget-wise and things like that, cost-wise. I think we can certainly put out, though, include in those resources and information for building owners, what types of financing and funding options are available and we can always add to that as we get more information and potentially new funding sources are added to that. Is that what your question was, Stacy, or does that help?
Are you okay with that timeline, I guess?
Thanks, Kim. I was starting to type. Maybe should be embarrassed about how confused I suddenly am. But if the baseline is 2021, but people aren't going to report until 2027, are we going to ask them to go back and put in the, some people aren't
sorry.
until it's due.
They will be benchmarking. They will start benchmarking this year. So we will have data, for every year that they will be benchmarking, and then we'll use that 2026 benchmarking data for the first performance standards compliance. Sorry if I wasn't clear on that.
Thanks. I'm glad I'm not completely, I was going to be really.
Sorry, I was sticking to the performance standards. Yep.
So, but that's my point, right? Is that it's what I feel like the concern is for people who are not already complying with the local ordinance. It's just the what and the how. And if they need to be getting 2021 data into some platform like Portfolio Manager, right? That's easy for some of us because we're all familiar and we know what it is. But for people who are not familiar, it's not easy. And so how do we start helping them understand the basics of the what and the basics of the how sooner rather than later?
Gotcha. Well, it's good. That might be a good transition in a few minutes to Touchstone IQ, since they are the ones who are helping us implement the statewide benchmarking program. And we will have a website up, a benchmarking website up in the next week or two with a lot of this information. And Touchstone IQ is going to provide a full service help center, live trainings, training videos, fact sheets, other resources, and everything to help prepare building owners just for the initial part of learning how to benchmark. So we will be providing all of those resources for building owners to get them prepared to even, do that first step of benchmarking this year. And sorry, I didn't understand that question the first time.
Great. All right, I will turn it over to you, Jessica. I will, did you want to share your screen or did you want me to share your PowerPoint?
You can go ahead and share. I can just let you know when to move it along.
Perfect. Great. It's all you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So again, here to talk with you guys a little bit about the covered buildings list that we developed over this past year for the Colorado statute. And essentially digging into some items here. We want to go to the next slide and run through what we'll cover. Essentially hoping to give you an understanding on how the covered buildings list was developed as my primary goal. And within these slides, we'll hear more on what a covered building is and how it's created, how we determine those buildings there, and then reasons why the covered buildings list might change. So what is a covered building? A covered building is made up of basic structure from the statute. So essentially, we know that all commercial, multifamily, and public buildings of 50,000 square feet and above must comply. This doesn't include, which gives us a lot of extra guidance in terms of which buildings should and should not be on this list. Buildings that shouldn't fall into kind of a little gray area here for a lot of reasons we can't say one way or the other in instances. Where storage facilities, standalone parking garages, and airplane hangars that specifically lack heating and cooling are eliminated from the list. Single family homes, duplexes, and triplexes are a little less gray, kind of more easily determined. But buildings in which more than half of the gross floor area is 50% or more manufacturing or industrial or agricultural purposes. Those, along with the storage facilities, standalone parking garages, and airplane hangars, become a little bit more difficult to determine without some owner feedback. So we certainly took some information that we had from our local programs in those areas for making those determinations, but ultimately across the state, there's a lot of buildings that may fit in these categories, but we couldn't necessarily determine that for sure without some owner input. So certain guidelines here that help us at least get a baseline of what we need to do and what we need to capture. So on to the next slide, we can talk a bit about how our covered buildings list is determined. So essentially our primary resource and where we start for these covered buildings lists is with the tax assessor. Tax assessor has public information on buildings. The issue with tax assessors on such a large scale here in Colorado, where we have 64 counties with independent tax assessors, the consistency across the board, as well as information collected on which buildings varies pretty widely. So essentially, we have a lot of things that you kind of have to take on a case-by-case per county level, when we're looking at the data we receive from an assessor. Tax exempt buildings being another one in which oftentimes assessors don't collect that information or collect partial information there for those buildings. GFA is oftentimes missing and or included as an aggregate of a parcel. Or there's multiple buildings on a parcel that just get completed together as a group GFA. Same with improvements. assessors often list improvements or additions to buildings vaguely. There's usually not any determination around where the improvement is or what building it's associated with. So there can be a lump sum of square footage we're trying to associate on a building level, as well as condominiums and commercial multifamily buildings vary too largely in how those pieces of information are reported, particularly on the owner level. So, we've talked a bit about tenants in this and in regards to multifamily, and oftentimes those condos are individual owners. So it definitely makes it sometimes tricky to get an aggregate GFA there as well when things are reported on an owner level there. So handful of things we run into that vary across county with assessor information. So we start there as our base and then move towards some other pieces of information and additional sources for square footage and missing buildings through public records. So we'll look at certain things like a list of schools, for instance, that tax assessors in certain counties may not collect as they might be considered tax exempt properties. So we'd look up schools across the state and then essentially factor in Google Maps. They have a great tool for estimating square footage, which we rely pretty heavily on in determining whether a building fits or doesn't into the square footage range. Of course, again, only so much we can do from a 2D map for the most part. Try to get the street view for building height, but oftentimes there may be some things that sneak on in this realm that shouldn't, and or things we missed because of it. So ultimately, do our best to assess all three sources of information and pull the relevant buildings on the map there. And it looks like we have a question here from Paul. Using Google Maps for buildings more than one floor, yes. So definitely gets tricky on that front. So essentially street view sometimes allows you to get a good idea of how many stories, but again, you can't confirm if there's a basement. So without tax assessor information, it definitely makes it a little bit tricky. So we do our best to gain as much information as we can, but certainly based on the information provided from the tax assessor and what's missing there, we kind of have to fill in the gaps as we can with these additional public records. Is data center exempt? Does it fit into the manufacturing category? Oh, the question disappeared. Someone tell me the rest of that question.
Yeah, it says, is a data center exempt? You could say it is manufacturing information. Certainly a Bitcoin mining operation is manufacturing a type of digital currency.
Yeah, interesting perspective. Not considered manufacturing from a portfolio manager definition. It's considered a data center. And specifically, there are no exemptions in the bill for a data center, so they would have to comply. Good question. We can go on to the next slide. So other buildings here that fit into kind of a scenario where you might find in a city that a building doesn't need to comply, but on the state level, those exemptions don't apply. So essentially the building wouldn't have to comply on a city level, but it would need to still comply with the state. So aside from the obvious square footage determination, certain public buildings have special exemptions and or just ordinance specific exemptions across the board. Other determinations essentially with this list that pull in city buildings just come from the basic exemptions listed within the statute we covered on the first slide. So if nothing fits that realm, even if the city deems a building not having to comply with a local program, it doesn't exempt them from complying on the state from the state's legal perspective. So here's just a quick breakdown of some of the property use types we have. We've listed out the number of buildings in each property use type. For now, a lot of these property use types are based off of the tax assessor information. So essentially, tax assessors do have their own use types that generally don't align one-to-one with what portfolio manager considers for use types. So on this front, we'll likely see some adjustments in the next year as people report what they consider or what property direction portfolio manager provides in terms of what they believe their use type is. But ultimately, for now, the breakdown seems to put a large chunk of buildings here in that commercial sector. And then you can see the next heavy front runner is our multifamily buildings. So it's kind of a nice breakdown to see where things kind of fall overall. Again, it is a little bit loose. Truthfully, we do often find these use types aren't terribly accurate either when the reporting season starts up. So I suspect we'll see commercial drop a bit and kind of sort into more appropriate use types. But for buckets, I think it gives an interesting perspective of kind of what we're working with and what to expect in each use type realm. And it looks like we had another question come in here. Let me see if I can find this one. Kirk, can you expand on how MF is identified? Kirk, I'm sorry, could you let me know what MF is standing for?
Multifamily.
Oh, yes, thank you. How multifamily is identified? Is it the aggregate of a campus of adjacent buildings? So multifamily definitely breaks down differently across the board, can obviously have different scenarios from an owner's perspective on kind of a multifamily property where there's multiple buildings on a parcel that are part of the same complex. Essentially identifying those for the most part come from the tax assessor list, but it gets a bit tricky on the square footage depending on how the tax assessor reports the GFA and depending on what type of multifamily in terms of condominium buildings with owners being specific. It sometimes doesn't come as a gross floor area of the building and more on just individual units. That coupled with the way improvements are often reported on a tax assessor level can also be a bit tricky to confirm square footage. So we definitely implement Google Maps as kind of our secondary check on things to make sure we're not over or underestimating, but truthfully, we oftentimes have to kind of pick something that we think makes sense for what we're looking at and seeing in a map view, and also potentially calculating from that view as well, if it's not super clear in the data. Does that help answer that? We didn't, in terms of the second part, we didn't make any child associations on this list. So essentially, if there is a property where an owner would either have usage metered together and they couldn't separate or submeter to report buildings separately, they could report buildings together as a campus in that way. But we didn't make any, straightaway assumptions on what should or should not be reported together, if anything.
Yeah, just flagging it for the group as it relates to like ease for the building owner to comply. And is it individual buildings that are trying to meet these targets? Is it a campus of buildings that are trying to meet this target?
Certainly a good point.
Just a consideration for the group.
And we will find over this year a handful of buildings that do get reported together for a variety of reasons. So that does end up reducing the number of reports, but not the buildings. It may end up actually increasing the number of buildings to some capacity in the database at least, but not the number that are required to report. I think we had another one come in here. Thank you, Crystal, for that resource.
Just asking, how is commercial defined? It's because it has offices and retail as separate categories in that chart.
So again, this is going off of tax assessor use types, and right away from your comment, I think you can see how things vary in terms of consistency here, in that I would think that those should be included in commercial. However, it's broken out in these three separate categories, which we're taking loose anyways. I think ultimately we'll see a little bit of a change in every single one of these categories for type. I think it's loose on the assessor side and how stringent they are on getting that accurate, and not just kind of checking a box with what they put there. Since we see that vary a lot in terms of what people think their building is versus what the tax assessor has classified it as originally. So just a nice kind of breakdown. We can get a good scope here on at least what we're starting with for anticipated uses. I got another question here from Kathy. Will schools report at the district level, or will we be asking each school building to report energy use? Up to the county. Truthfully, usually the way it goes is someone from the district reports the whole group of schools. So they'll have a portfolio where each building that's required is just submit by one person that's designated from the district level, just to reduce that burden on schools. There's enough on their plate as it is already, especially right now. So it kind of is more of a programmatic thing from a legal standpoint, and from our management of the reporting season. We don't have a strict route for people to take, and certainly we'll work with districts and schools in this front and make sure it's easy for them to accomplish and they get what they need out of it the best way possible. We can head on to the next slide here. We have another graph here showing some square footage buckets, essentially a breakdown of the number of buildings by square foot. Chose to go with some bucket routes here because we do have a little bit of an outlier situation on the low end and the high end. These come into play again with the notes on inconsistencies and missing information within tax assessor records. So oftentimes square footage can be missing in buildings where we aren't getting that information from tax assessors at all. They don't track it. We have a hard time confirming that square footage. So the count of zeros is where we either weren't able to get that information from a tax assessor or weren't able to determine it through other routes, be it Google Maps or what have you. The high end falls likely in the situations where tax assessors report back information on a parcel level, or where there's multiple buildings on a parcel and it's hard to determine where the square footage breaks down exactly there if it's not laid out in that manner. So we suspect a handful, if not the majority of those on the larger end, are shared kind of campus or unintentionally campus square footages that basically are aggregating multiple buildings on one single parcel and just sharing it as the square footage of one building. So interesting breakdown though to see that 50K to 100K is really where the bulk of our buildings will be. I don't suspect at least that category to vary too widely. And really it does have that concentration there up to around 200,000 for where we'll see the bulk of our reports come in terms of usage. So here we can toggle between this slide and the next slide for some context. This slide is the graph that shows kind of our breakdown here of volume of reports coming in through territory. So if just quickly we want to hop to the next slide and then we can hop back. Here's essentially where we've split in terms of what you're looking at on the graph here, regions for reports. So we'll have the Northwest, Northeast, Southwest, Southeast, Front Range, and kind of this central chunk of Colorado here. So if we head back up to the graph, we can kind of look at how that breaks down with our local programs and really kind of the central hub here with Denver and some of our larger cities. Not surprising to see the bulk of our reports are going to come in through the Front Range. But South Central certainly as a runner up here has a lot of buildings to pay attention to and likely more buildings coming on board over the future years in some of our other kind of lower required territories here. But was certainly an interesting breakdown considering how large of a state we have to see really that concentration fall very heavily into that Front Range realm.
Jessica, question.
Yes.
If you had put El Paso into the Front Range category, do you think that South Central would be similar to the others where it's only a couple hundred?
That's a great question. I can't remember the exact numbers of buildings we have in El Paso, but I think could be likely. They definitely have a lot of the larger buildings there out of that group. So it might reduce them a little bit. Yeah, if we did want to consider them as a Front Range territory.
I think there'd be a lot in Colorado Springs.
Yeah, certainly. I'd say Colorado Springs is probably the next heavy hitter that is likely contributing to the majority of the extra percentage we see there.
And then just a quick question about were grocery stores listed as a building category? It's probably speaking to
the use types graph. Yeah. I don't believe so. I believe they'd be considered commercial. We can do a quick scan here.
Oh yeah, supermarket, grocery store.
Supermarket, perfect. Yes. So they got included. We calculated 58 of those. Again, I think there's probably some crossover in categories. I suspect likely there's more than 58 grocery stores. I could be wrong. That hit in the 50K range, but could potentially be an accurate count for the state, considering the concentration on the Front Range we see in some of this other breakdown on the next graph. But likely some got grouped in on a tax assessor scale into commercial. That category is so large, it leads me to believe there's a good chunk in there that we'll find are categorized differently, or even in some categories here that we have already, and we're just thrown generically into commercial from a tax assessor perspective.
Great. And then do you know where DIA falls on this? I mean,
also a good question. Square footage wise, gosh, they're a big one. Kelsey, if you know real quick or can do a quick search for us, I think we're kind of all interested. I think
just the question was like, where are airport terminals? And I don't know if
airport terminals were included. They're usually defined as like hangars or commercial.
Okay.
But I can, if the question is how big DIA is. I can look that up on the list.
I think it's more just where do they land? Because yeah, obviously DA.
Use type wise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And again, these aren't end all be all use types. It's just all we have to go off of in terms of information right now for those. Really, in terms of the biggest changes, that's probably where we'll see them, is almost consistently use type related on almost every submission we see will be kind of a change from what we're thinking it is right now. I'd say buckets might stay relatively consistent, but commercial for sure is so generic. There's going to be a ton pulled out and thrown into more specific categories. And we'll definitely know more as we start to see these reports trickle in, but for now we don't have any more to go off of.
Okay, great.
So going back to, I guess, adding on to where this is kind of all heading is reasons why the covered buildings list would change and will change. Essentially new buildings coming on, small reason why it would change, but certainly we will identify new buildings that were missed from the first round. There will also be new construction that comes on board and will get added to this list over the years. Exempt properties, so essentially certain buildings might be taken off by letting us know, giving us proper documentation to determine their square footage doesn't meet the requirements, confirming that they are in fact 50% or more agricultural, industrial, manufacturing, showing us that they are an airplane hangar that lacks heating and cooling. So certain things like that, all of those reasons we can't say definitively without some owner input may come into play as well for properties that get removed. Certain properties might be included as duplicate properties. So ultimately we might have caught something twice just based on the way the tax assessor reports improvements and or multiple buildings on a parcel. Certain things might get mushed into just one for a report. Child properties. So essentially we might, again, things that get mushed into one report may end up nestling some buildings that we think should report under other buildings. When we learn more about their energy connections, potentially they're unable to report those two buildings' energy usage separately. So in turn, they've reported under one report. And then incorrect gross floor area, essentially going back to similar with use types. Oftentimes the assessor is a little bit off and it could mean the difference between being 50K or 49,500. So certain things like that might take some people off the building list, as well as add them on if we find certain buildings do meet that square footage that we missed initially in certain things like those public realms or tax exempt realms that the tax assessor wasn't initially providing to us for data. And I believe, yep, Q&A. So I know we've kind of been doing it as we go. So if anybody has any final thoughts here.
Jessica, Joel here from United Power. I have a few questions, if I may.
Sure.
So the first thing is, my understanding is the letter notification to building owners was going to go out this month or sometime this quarter. Do you have a date available, or anybody else on the call, when those notifications will be sent out?
We're still working towards that as kind of a program level, considering we're coordinating with local programs in terms of communication timelines. So more to come there. The goal is February at some point, considering that data requests and the ability for people to report is going to open March 1st.
Okay. Also, and I know everyone's aware of this, but it's worth repeating. Our commercial account usage is down by like 10% or something in 2021, obviously related to COVID, and that's going to be our baseline year. So certainly we all need to consider how we're adjusting for that. And I think occupancy in the site EUI is probably a good approach. And then you'd also mentioned new build buildings. And we have several in our area. We're growing very quickly. How are we going to baseline those? I don't recall seeing that captured in the law.
That's a great question. I do not have the answer to that, but that is a really good point. Considering any buildings that either may come on this year, which I think likely could comply and get that baseline, but any new construction that comes on in next year or later. That is a good point to bring up, I think, to the group.
Yeah, just to jump in, we're going to have to model that, the expected new construction and figure that out with some additional data analysis.
Okay. Then the last thing that I had from my stakeholders was energy efficiency improvements. Obviously, new construction is going to be up to the latest code, and it's going to be incrementally more difficult for them to shave off greenhouse gases off of those new construction buildings. And I think this group has talked about that before, but I just wanted to make note of it again.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I mean, I think in general that the hope is that these buildings that are being built to newer codes, higher performance standards will in fact meet whatever building performance standards that the task force recommends from the outset, and can meet them through the next 8 years potentially. So yeah, I mean, I think we will, or potentially this task force will focus more on the lower performing buildings, and those standards won't be as difficult to meet for a building that is newly constructed and already built to newer codes.
Thanks, Kim. Before I go to you, Karen, I just wanted to ask the question from Paul. Can we tell federal government to meet state standards? Is that something we can do?
I think we can ask them. It will probably be more voluntary.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had two things because, like Joel, we have a lot of new buildings coming online. So I guess one thing is I think there needs to be outreach to the building departments in the cities and counties, because we can add, the planning and building can add a comment saying you need to comply with this, whatever it is, and send them a link to whatever it is we end up with. And I think that would help them comply, at least so that they know. And then the other one is that it came to our attention in Aurora that PUC has a docket right now that where and I think it's the investor-owned utilities, because it's the PUC, they would not get rebate. They would not give incentives to pay for natural gas infrastructure. And that would have a huge effect if we're building new buildings without natural gas. And somebody has to pay for that, and it would be passed on to somebody if for us, Xcel Energy is not reimbursing for the cost of natural gas infrastructure, which includes, the distribution, the big part. So I didn't know. I just wanted to throw that out there, that's been something that I think would affect what we're doing. Is if anybody else is paying attention to that docket, at some point we probably need to get an update on that.
Thanks, Karen. I just wanted to get Kirk's question out there as well. So knowing that the covered building list depends on owner feedback and regarding compliance with interim targets, if a building is not on the covered building list and the owner is not notified about the requirements, do they need to comply with the interim targets? Would be a question for you, Kim.
I think it's more of like a question for the group to maybe consider when we're putting recommendations forward as well, how we would, and maybe I think that's probably for the next section on the agenda that we're going into.
I mean, if they're not on our list, then I don't know how we would know that they complied or not. I guess I'm not clear on that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, the admin side of that, like, how would you?
I mean, when we did the covered buildings list with Jess and their team, we didn't get them all, and it's difficult to find all of the covered buildings list, and so we put the burden on the building owners to self-report that information. But building owners do not like to think that they're kind of getting out of a requirement, and then later you find them and say, hey, now you have to comply. That just, they want to be able to plan as far in advance as possible. So it just creates a little bit of a conflict between, the program administrator and the building owner.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. We'll definitely note that in the notes and bring that up, I think, when we talk about compliance pathways in the process, because I think that's important to consider. Great.
Yeah, and another aspect too, just to add on that, is in terms of baseline data, just to add to your conversation there, is in terms of collecting reports, we are able to maintain a link that could collect 2021 data at any time. So there is an option for if someone did come on in the future, if possible for them to access that data, could submit it still as a baseline year. So an option just to have on the table.
Thanks, Jessica.
I could just note in Denver, the way we handle that is we did our very best to put together a very complete covered buildings list, but the city attorney's office was clear that so all of our compliance notices and all of our advice and help to help folks comply is just that. It's us being helpful. It's the building owner's job to comply with the law, and the law says buildings over a certain size have to benchmark, and now they have to meet certain performance standards. And so it's sort of why we also need to do broader outreach. Like, yes, we'll do direct targeted outreach to buildings that we know are on the covered buildings list, but building owners have the responsibility to comply with the law. And if for some reason they didn't get like one of the state's notices, I would assume they're still have that responsibility and should sort of reach out and get themselves added to the list, right?
Thanks.
Could I ask a follow-up question to Katrina, maybe? Do you have instances where I'm sure you do, the building owner is out of state or out of country? And are there interstate or international laws that come into effect? And does that affect our engagement approach for those types of building owners?
It's a good question. I don't think the laws affect it at all. We do send compliance notices to owners that are out of state, where the assessor's office shows that the owner is out of state. And often they have, a local property management firm who they have handle compliance on their behalf. But I don't think we have any problem with requiring those buildings to comply just because the owner is out of state.
Yeah, I would say about 50% of our covered building owners list is out-of-state owners through real estate investment trusts and the like. And the way that we administer it is very similar to a land use kind of ordinance or a land use kind of process. If you're owning, operating, or if you're building, you have to follow our local rules.
Yeah, that's a great thing to bring up too, Joel, in terms of engagement and ensuring, because yeah, I'm sure that's the case a lot in Denver as well, of building owners that might not live here. So great. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Bill, I see your hand up there.
Yeah, what do we do about data centers? We have a data center client that's currently at 2 megawatts of IT load. It's going to 10 megawatts of IT load. And the building owner is not the one with the load, it's the tenant. And so there is no way they can comply. So what do we do?
I think that we can reserve that for our future conversations when we talk about other alternate compliance pathways for different property types. It's definitely, we definitely will address that in future meetings, because we know that, yes, it might be nearly impossible for some property types with high loads like data centers or hospitals or things like that to meet, one specific target. So that's why we'll be talking about alternative pathways for compliance.
Great. Well, thank you, Jessica. We really appreciate it. And thanks. I think it was Kelsey, right, that was helping with that. I really appreciate, we all really appreciate your digging into that data and providing that for us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us, Diane and group. I guess final comment here before I let you guys go is we now have an online source for the covered buildings list that we're going to use for building owners specifically. So we're not going to have the spreadsheet format available to download in bulk for anyone's purposes. It's on a building address search feature, so you can pull up your building ID and items like that there. It's going to be a live connection with the system we use to manage the reporting. So essentially it updates to reflect the most recent building ID changes, new building additions and things like that on an instant basis. So it's going to be the resource moving forward. So you guys, I think it's easier to use the spreadsheet version. So just you have the full picture there on it's not something that's going to remain the most accurate version moving forward. So
thank you.
That is all. Thanks so much. Let us know if you guys have any other questions. Happy to get back to you there. And I hope you all have a great day.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Great.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
All right, we're gonna pivot a little bit and just take a break. That was a lot of us talking at you. So we'll take a break, stretch your legs, grab some water, whatever you need, and we'll come back at 2:40 for the presentation on benchmarking data. All right, we'll give folks a couple more minutes to head back and then we'll kick it off again. I did my yoga teacher training virtual, and he used to have a timer. And when the timer went off, you had to be back sitting at your table. And it was not the nicest sounding timer.
Do it. Timer.
Perfect. Well, just to respect everybody's time, I think we'll kick it off. So we did pivot the agenda a little bit. So we're going to spend the next portion of this agenda with going over the benchmarking data. So Hillary from Lotus is going to present on that. And again, I think that flow of, you can ask questions in the chat and we can answer them throughout the presentation. Otherwise, we'll also have a Q&A at the end. So whatever makes the most sense. But we feel there might be quite a few questions here, which is great. So we've left a little bit more time for Q&A here. So Hillary, I will pass it over to you and I will share my screen.
Perfect. Hey, everyone. So a lot of what I'll be speaking to is building off the presentation that Jessica just gave. And we'll be providing an overview of what data is already being reported in Denver, Boulder, and Fort Collins. The good news is that a lot of data is already being reported, and then the data isn't clearly improving year over year in quality and an increase of numbers of buildings that are reporting. The unsurprising news is that some of the reported data has some gaps and improvements to be made. And we still have a while to go before we have a 2021 baseline. However, the very good news is that the CEO, Touchstone IQ, and Group 14, which Group 14 will speak a little bit later about the work they'll be doing, have a plan to help fill in those gaps and create a defensible baseline for 2021. And so I'm really doing a high level kind of first glance at the data that's available. And I will do my best to answer any questions that you have. But we also have Katrina, who can answer probably quite a few questions. And then also it sounds like Stacy, you're really familiar with the Fort Collins program. So, all right, if we go to the next slide. So first I'll speak to the data that we got. The CEO, mainly Crystal, so thank you, Crystal, went through and cleaned up a lot of the city benchmarking data that was provided and worked to ensure that there was consistent terminology being used. So for example, she started utilizing the EPA defined property types for each data set. So it took a lot of work. So thank you so much, Crystal. I know that you did other pieces to the data as well that she can speak to. Then Lotus looked at the data that was available for each of these communities. And each data set had various issues, such as unreported GFAs, and then that missing electricity or natural gas usage. And then obviously COVID caused a lot of reporting issues where some people are just delayed on reporting their data for obvious reasons. But when impossible, we cleaned up the data a little bit further. However, I just want to make sure that's clear, just so you take our findings with a grain of salt. And then lastly, we looked at the data that we currently have compared to the covered building list that Touchstone IQ just went over to try to understand kind of where the gaps were. So what we found is that about 50% of Boulder's eligible buildings are reporting already. So according to the list that Touchstone provided, excuse me, there's 305 eligible buildings. 18 of those did not have square footage reported in the the list so far by Touchstone. However, 166 of those buildings were reporting already for the Boulder. So about 50% going. So that's a great start, but definitely a while to go. And then Denver, excuse me, I'm also recovering from COVID, like probably many of you guys. Denver had a much higher rating with 93% of the eligible buildings represented reporting, and that covered about 98% of the square footage that was reported. Obviously, Denver's program has been going on longer than many of the programs, and they have strong data going back to 2016. So we'll review some of those trends later in the presentation. And as I said, Katrina can answer a lot of these questions as well, I'm sure. And then also my Kim from the Lotus team will also be looking at some of the Energized Denver compliance pathways later on. And then the Fort Collins program, it's about 76% of the buildings are being reported, and that accounts for 80% of the GFA. I would like to note that the data for Fort Collins, when I'm speaking to it in this presentation, is from 2019, while Boulder and Denver is from 2020. So when you look at the overall state of comparing this data to the state of Colorado and Touchstone's list that they provided, which, as I said, they're still finalizing everything, it represents about 26% of the buildings, and then that's about 32% of the square footage. So that's a really good starting point. If there was 100% of all the buildings in Boulder, Fort Collins, and Denver were reporting, we would think that would be about 30% of total buildings and 35% of total square footage would report. So just from those 3 cities. So a really good start there. We'd also like to note that the EPA is also providing a lot of data to the CEO that's not included in this. And it's the data that's being reported through the energy portfolio manager. And initial estimates think that's about 40% of the gross, the GFA is being reported through there. So also there's additional buildings that are not within those 3 cities that are reporting through Energy Star. And we can definitely speak to that a little bit more as we go, because I know, Kim, you're pretty familiar with some of the data that's coming in and the work they're doing for you. So next slide. So this table shows the overall kilowatt hour natural gas reporting through those programs. And this is for all building types when you're looking at the KBTU square footage, and the EUI, which is not necessarily the most helpful metric, right? Because as we've spoken to in several of these questions we've had, is that, a data center versus a school versus, a commercial building can all have very different EUIs. However, I think this slide is really interesting for looking at the overall energy use for cities. So Boulder, for what's already being reported in the program, it represents 26% of the electricity that's being used in the city in 2020. So that the 50% of buildings that we spoke to literally do cover already 26% of the total electricity being consumed in the commercial and industrial sector in Boulder in 2020, and about 18% of the natural gas. So it's a huge percentage when you look at a city level. Denver, that's even higher. We saw that it's 54% of the electricity is being reported in this program for all commercial and industrial, and then 44% of the natural gas. So I feel like that's really telling of how impactful this program is and how much it's actually covering of the total load for these cities when it comes to the commercial industrial sector. So next slide, we'll go over more EUIs. So the slide you're looking at is a count of the top 5 for each one of the city's building types. So Boulder had 49 building type or office buildings, and it was the #1 of the EPA building types that was being reported that fell under the Touchstone list. Denver had a huge amount of multifamily, so it had 555. So it kind of talks about a little bit of that target market, versus like Fort Collins, it had 21 of the office buildings. So definitely a large difference of the number of buildings, but I just wanted to point out that each city has its different kind of target area that they're going to have to focus on by building type. So if you go to the next slide. So this slide is a little bit, I think, more helpful when comparing EUIs. As I alluded to, the data of quality definitely can be a little bit all over the place. And even though we did some scrubbing, obviously there'll be a whole nother level of kind of QA/QC on the data to get that 2021 baseline. But we wanted to kind of give a high overview of what we are seeing. In general, we're seeing that distribution centers, hotels, and multifamily not multifamily offices are all reporting higher EUIs than the national average. And some ways significantly so. For example, for Collins, the EUI for offices was at 106 versus the national average, which was 52.9. Some of that can definitely be data availability and data quality that we'll want to look at. Some of it might be color specific or weather specific. So I just want to note that that's just kind of a telling metric, but it definitely something that we're going to drive into. Also, we can see that labs, which were brought up earlier, has a huge range, basically because there's usually only a few of these facilities. So the national average is 115, but we're seeing a crazy number in Boulder for 614 EUI, and then going all the way to Denver. And once again, those are sometimes there's So it's just something that we'll want to keep in mind. And I know that group 14 will be digging into in more depth. So if you go to the next slide. So for Collins, we weren't able to have year-over-year trends, but we were able to look at some trends for Boulder and Denver. And as you know, a lot of this can be a little bit tricky because there's definitely COVID impacts, but this is taking into account the increase in square footage. So you see that in this third column over. There's an increase in reported GFA. Some years it's drastic, like Denver between 2016 and 2017. It's almost, it's over 16 million square foot. And then the 2019 to 2020, a huge increase in the amount of buildings that we're reporting and square footage. So these numbers are taking that into account. But it is hard to grab trends because I would say, obviously, 2020 numbers can be a little bit tricky with COVID. Generally speaking, we have seen a reduction in weather normalized site EUI, which is promising. And I think we probably could speak to a little bit more of those trends. And I know that Katrina maybe could speak to them too in Denver, but they have been overall, I think Denver has been seeing an increase in building energy usage year over year. However, the buildings that have been benchmarked have been seeing a reduction year over year, even if it is slight. So we can speak to that a little bit later in the Q&A. And then if you want to go to the next slide. This is a slide that we grabbed from Denver, and it's on the benchmarking data, and it's weather normalized site EUI by property type. And so what it's showing is that some property types have seen a significant reduction, whether you can account to it from the benchmarking program or for whatever reason, they have seen a large reduction year over year. Apartments, for example, have seen consistent going down, same with condominiums, while municipal has actually seen an increase so year over year, as well as distribution centers. We'll also see non-refrigerated warehouses go down as well as hotels. And I'm not able to necessarily dig in to exactly why those reductions are happening, but maybe we can ask during the Q&A to see if there's any sort of lessons we can learn from the Denver program that Katrina can mention. So I believe then we were going to go into, I know that this is really high overview, but what I wanted to make clear is to kind of go into that group 14, the work that they'll be working on, and maybe how it's going to fill in some of those gaps. So I'm not sure if group 14 wants to jump in, or if Kim or Crystal, you want to kind of talk about the work that they'll be doing and how it's going to take some of this, but really finalize it and make it into, I guess, a more defensible baseline.
Yeah, I'm happy to turn it over to Laura from Group 14 to talk a little bit about what their approach is going to be.
Hello. So yeah, I am Laura Dias with Group 14 Engineering. We are very excited to be working with the task force and the state on this. We helped Denver with, we provided an electrification and energy efficiency tool for Denver as they were developing their program. And the tool that we'll be helping create for this program as well is to give you guys an idea of what the decisions you make, how they impact the greenhouse gas emission savings, and what that looks like over the long term. So what we'll be doing is we'll be taking a lot of the data that Touchstone and Lotus has been combing through, so that benchmarking data from Denver and Boulder and Fort Collins, we'll be using that as kind of the basis of our buildings, as well as the covered buildings list, to kind of determine what our baseline, one, working off of setting our baseline, and then also looking at those buildings in the long term, looking at EUI in the long term and how those reductions will impact the greenhouse gas emission savings. So we'll also be determining emissions factors, which emissions factors we'll be using for the full state. There is a lot of this is just still in works and still in discussion. So we'll be refining this, and this tool will be it'll be built and worked on in concert with you guys. We'll have several iterations. I'm sure you're going to see multiple versions of this tool to help you make decisions as you move through your task force and your agendas together. But we'll have the first iteration, we'll put that emissions factor, and we'll start with that initial emissions factor information. We'll add in those covered buildings. And then from there, we'll hopefully have the option to model different reduction paths, potentially prescriptive paths, whatever you guys are, as you guys are working through this, we'll be working with you. And again, this is, I know, very high level, not very detailed, but we're just starting this effort, and it's going to be really guided by what the task force is deciding on. So hopefully that gives you some real emissions factor real greenhouse gas emissions savings information to help you make decisions in the long term for the state.
Great, thanks, Laura. Kim and Crystal, do you have anything to add on the benchmarking data before we open it up to Q&A? It's fine if you don't, just want to throw that out there.
I don't think I do, Crystal, unless you wanted to make any comments about the data.
I just wanted to, because I'm sure we'll have questions around it, but if Hillary and Kim from Lotus could kind of just, I know that was a high level presentation, but just brief everyone again on how you came up with those numbers and your methodology, essentially, and like the compliance rates and things like that. We do have city reps from those cities on the call as well. So just kind of giving us more detail on that. And also, I think you already mentioned that this data is preliminary. There's some data missing. This isn't necessarily a complete picture. We will be working with group 14 and the baseline data in the future. But yeah, if Lotus could go a little bit more into that.
Yeah, no, it was definitely the data that we got. As I said, there are some gaps, but a lot of the data is really high quality. So I want to make sure that I wasn't saying like throwing it under the bus. There's a lot of really, really great data that's already there. It was just that I just wanted to make sure that you guys acknowledge that there was a little bit there. So from just general calculations, we did have the overall square footage, and we wanted to make sure that we were only accounting for the square footage that actually reported electricity and natural gas usage, or just electricity, just either one of them, energy use in general. So that's how we were able to back into the EUI, the square foot, just, pretty simple calculation to get to that, and then combining those two. And then we did it by building type, which, as I mentioned, Crystal had gone through and made sure that all the buildings that were provided through Boulder, Denver, and Fort Collins all were falling within these building types defined by the in the EPA. And so we were able to just do simple pivot tables to kind of cross compare and figure out how much electricity, natural gas were being used by each one of those building types by the amount of square footage that was being reported. And we also, of course, were only looking at buildings that would fall under this program. So buildings that were over 50,000 square feet as well. So it was only ones that would be falling within this program. We weren't looking at all the buildings that are being benchmarked for each one of those cities if they do not qualify for the program, for the CEO one. And I don't know, Katrina, if you want to add any kind of contents. I know I keep on mentioning your name. I just know that you're an expert, obviously, in all things Energized Denver, but you guys do a full QA/QC of a lot of the data that comes in as well. So it is high quality data for that side of things.
Thanks, Hillary. Yeah, I think if Katrina or Kirk have anything to add on the data, now's a good time for that as well.
I don't have anything to add right now. I thought that was a good presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions if there's more in-depth questions from the task force, but I want to do what's useful to task force members.
Thanks, Katrina.
I just wanted to add Fort Collins data is not probably need to do another pass on that. Definitely want to update those numbers. Stacy Baumgarten is one of my stakeholders, so I just want him make sure that we are capturing your benchmark data. Don't worry, Stacy.
Love it. Great. And now we'll open up to any questions around the benchmarking data. Michael, did you have a question?
I have several questions, but not on this particular topic. So, sorry. Just deep in thought and for the right time to ask my question. So.
You can always put them in the chat so you don't forget.
I guess I had a question on the timeline. I understand that getting to good data that really can answer the questions that we have is the next step. And I'm wondering, as we start to think about how we meet this target kind of across the portfolio of building types and geographies, I won't anticipate, but there may be some trade-offs between different use types. So I guess, when does that question come up in our process? And I assume that we'll have good data at that point to assess. So, question on timeline.
I think that's what Group 14 will be working on too, with putting together this policy design tool. And it will be a spreadsheet to put in a lot of different kind of options or show the different pathways through different targets, whether it's EUI or other metrics that the task force is considering, and seeing how that will get us to our ultimate sector-wide greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. When can we expect like a working version of the tool? And apologize, I don't mean to, if I'm leading this process too much, but when can we start to poke around as to what that might look like?
We are having our kickoff on Monday, so we have yet to start. So we will have the initial data into the tool. I'm hoping we'll be finalizing timeline with the state on Monday. So we'll have a better sense then. But we'll start populating that data this coming week. And then we'll have an initial version. Probably I'd have to take a look at our what we originally outlined, but probably towards end of February is we'll probably have the first version, and we'll go from there. So, and it will be an iterative process, so it will be updated along the way as well.
I'll put a link in the chat to Denver's tool so you can kind of see how that was used, because that's public too.
Thanks, Karen. We'll make sure that when we send out materials and things, once they finalize that, we'll send that out to the task force as well, because that's a great question. Any other questions? Oh, Bill had a question in the chat, Hillary.
Yep. Yeah, I saw that. So this is actually a question that maybe Kirk or Katrina could also jump in, because I wasn't privy to all the data, like the occupancy rates. We did not have those numbers. But the question is, did you just see a decrease in EUI in office buildings because of COVID and a drop in occupancy? While I wasn't able to look at that data specifically, my guess is that you probably could see a strong correlation in that, but I don't know if Kirk or Katrina, you guys have done a deeper analysis into those numbers. I can say with confidence from the Lotus side of doing greenhouse gas inventories and energy work across the state, we have seen that because of COVID. So it is something you'll want to keep in mind for, moving forward in the baseline. But I don't know, Kirk and Katrina, if you want to speak to that. But it might have not been across the board of every building type. That's one thing, obviously, to keep in mind. So.
Benchmarking data is submitted once a year, so it's really hard to kind of tease that out. You might, if you get the monthly data, you might be able to see something. From a utilities perspective, we saw about a 5% drop right after the governor's COVID orders, but that was from our utilities customers, but that rebounded fairly quickly.
Yeah, I would just add, we saw a small drop in building energy use from 2019 to 2020 that I would attribute to the pandemic, but it was, I think, about 2%. So very minimal. I think it was slightly larger in offices, and then I suspect building energy use went up a bit in other building types like multifamily. I can pull that analysis if folks want like a presentation on effects of the pandemic in more detail in a subsequent meeting, but it wasn't large, right? It was a pretty minimal change in energy use that we saw in 2020. So we were a little surprised and just were like, okay, I guess it didn't actually change things very much. Mostly if there's one person in the building or if there's 300 in the building, you still got to run and operate the building. And so it didn't change things a lot.
I will also add to this too. Obviously, Denver and Fort Collins know their data better. If I can find the link, I remember in the summer of 2020, however long ago that was, New York City was actually not seeing a drop in their commercial building energy use, even though people weren't working in offices. And I believe they did a study into that, and they found that, like Katrina said, a lot of appliances weren't shut off, a lot of lights weren't shut off. So this is something that multiple organizations will probably be looking into, but essentially research will need to look into that kind of stuff. So there may not always be that expected decrease in commercial energy use.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. And that John and Stacy also noted that in the chat, and Bill also made a point too of office building use going down, but multifamily going up. And we did see some of that, as Hillary talked about, some different in our greenhouse gas emission data from 2019 to 2020. A lot of people, were staying warm at home and things like that. So that'll be good to note.
I'm curious too, benchmarking is an enabling program. It's not really, there are some behavioral savings that come out of benchmarking, but were we able to compare any of the covered buildings from Fort Collins, Denver, Boulder with Xcel Energy program participation with rebates? Because the true savings is coming from the building upgrade, not from the benchmarking data. So that could be interesting to look at as well.
Yeah, I do not have that data, but or privy to that data, but it's a really interesting point for sure.
Yeah, that is a good point. And I don't think that we get that data. Katrina, correct me if I'm wrong, but you do not get the actual rebate program data from Xcel Energy. Is that right?
That's right. Xcel doesn't share data with us about which buildings have participated in their programs. We do share our benchmarking data with them. So if you wanted that analysis, you'd have to ask them.
Great. And then there's a question from Bill. Do you have any data correlating Energy Star rating with EUI? Is EUI staying constant, but Energy Star going down?
I think we could maybe dig into those, because in some of the data that we had had Energy Star rating, especially from the EPA. I don't know, Kim, if that's something that we could ask from the EPA. They're doing that analysis. If that's any data they could provide.
Yeah, we can certainly ask them for that.
Popped in the chat, portfolio manager lists the national median EUIs by property use type. So that's a reference point.
Great. Perfect. All right. Well, I am looking at your question, Michael, as well. I think that's a great question. So I think if we could pivot and maybe discuss that quickly. Kim, did you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something for kind of leave it up to the task force to recommend. I mean, we do need to meet those longer term goals. I think hopefully that the actions that building owners take, well, they'll balance each other out, right? I mean, some in the short term, potentially if they electrify, they might increase their energy use, but over the longer term, those emissions will go down. So I think that's something we have to look across the entire sector to really make that determination.
Yeah, so we'll take note of that, Michael, and ensure we include that in our future conversations, definitely. Great. Well, I'm going to ask you all to help me determine what's happening next, because I feel like we've given you a lot of information. And so we can go one of two ways. We could we could talk about next steps. There's some items that we just want to make sure we're all on the same page on before the next meeting. And we could end potentially a little bit early, or we can breeze through a high level of energy efficiency compliance pathways to prepare us for our next meeting. So is it helpful to breeze through that and give an overview to be thinking about before the next meeting, or should we leave all compliance pathway conversations to meeting number 7? So I guess thumbs up if you want to breeze through and talk about compliance pathways, and then a thumbs down if you're just ready to kind of wrap up and digest all the information we just gave you. And there's no wrong answer. We got a lot of thumbs ups. All right, a couple of thumbs downs. Okay. I guess that looks like consensus. Great. Well, I'm going to pass it over to Kim. And so again, knowing that this is a very quick run through of compliance pathways around energy efficiency, know that we will dive a lot deeper into at meeting number 7. So I'll pass it over to you, Kim.
Awesome. Thanks, Diane. So like I said, or as Diane said, we'll breeze through this quickly. And Diane, do you want me to share my screen or? Oh, you got it. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to, as she gets that set up, and I apologize, my camera's here and notes are here. So if I'm not looking at you, I really am. We're going to be looking, I'll talk today quickly about 5 different building performance standards from across the country. So we're going to look at Washington State, Washington, DC, Energize Denver, Boston, and then New York City. And one thing that I just want to make really clear before I dive in is that energy efficiency, we're talking about energy efficiency compliance pathways. Energy efficiency is really the core compliance pathway for all of these standards. So in some cases, standards really went into detail about the options for energy efficiency and what those look like. And others just simply, said, you have to improve the efficiency of your building and left it at that. So some have better detail than others, and you'll see that as we go through. Next slide, please. So Boston's building performance standard is the second version of their policy. The first one, BRDO, 1.0 was their benchmarking law, and then they updated it for their building performance standard. So the metric that the Boston BPS uses is a greenhouse gas intensity metric. That greenhouse gas intensity is set by building type. And so to get the target greenhouse gas reduction per building, basically we take the greenhouse gas intensity and multiply it by the gross floor area of the building. This law covers commercial and multifamily buildings over 20,000 square feet or with more than 15 units for multifamily. And the overarching goal of the program is to achieve the emission reductions that you see there. So this is an example of one of the programs that didn't give a whole lot of specificity as to what those energy efficiency compliance pathways are. But they mention in the law that envelope improvements, appliance upgrades, appliance switches, so that means moving to a different energy source, or building operations and controls were all available options to meet the greenhouse gas intensity standard. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry, actually one more thing I'll quickly mention on Boston. We'll dive into this in future meetings, but they have a few, this newer law established several compliance pathways. So they have renewable energy compliance pathways and on a pathway for alternative compliance payments for those who cannot reach their target. And like I said, we'll dive into that at future meetings. Thanks, Dan. Sorry about that. So the Washington State Building Performance Standard, their metric is going to use a weather normalized site EUI. So the state of Washington has an ordinance that, requires that the state develop a building performance standard. That building performance standard has not been developed yet. But within the ordinance, it did outline some very specific energy efficiency measures that must be included when the law is written. One thing that's interesting about Washington is that they worked with ASHRAE to develop a standard, which is ASHRAE Standard 100 2018, and they're using that standard to determine the EUI targets by property type. sort of target overall reduction for that's noted within the standard is to achieve a 15% energy use reduction. And that's taken from the average energy use between 2009 and 2018. Sorry, is there a question? Nope. And this building performance standard covers commercial buildings greater than 50,000 square feet. Like I said, the program details are still being developed, but it will require an investment grade energy audit to identify energy improvement opportunities, and that the buildings must invest in the energy efficiency measures identified in that audit that meet a savings to investment ratio of 1 or greater. So those are sort of the pieces that are already outlined that must be included in the law, but beyond that, we don't have a lot of information. Next slide, please. So Washington, D.C. is next, and their building performance standard uses an Energy Star score, or for those who can't get an Energy Star score, the equivalent metric that they're using is source EUI. So they set their standard for each property type based on the district median performance of the property type. The interesting thing about the DC building performance standard is that there are multiple compliance pathways. All of them are specific to energy efficiency. So this is the one building performance standard that does not allow alternative compliance paths for renewable energy. And it's because DC has a separate renewable portfolio standard for their buildings. It's also interesting that they require a building to select their performance pathway at the start of the reporting cycle. And I'll explain why that's important here in a little bit. Overall, the targets that they set per property type aim to reduce EUI by 20%. This standard covers commercial and multifamily buildings over 10,000 square feet, and you can see the overarching target for DC's buildings there. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the pathways. So like I said, there's 3 pathways. One's performance based, one is called a standard target pathway, and then there's a prescriptive pathway. So in the performance pathway, you have to achieve a 20% reduction in EUI in the cycle. And when you achieve that, you have to share what you did to your building to get there. Now, the second pathway is the one that is really interesting. So the standard target pathway is designed for buildings in a high performing property type. If a building falls within that high performing property type, which is defined as an Energy Star standard of 50 or higher, and that building has a site EUI that's less than 20% away from reaching that Energy Star standard, the building doesn't have to achieve a 20% reduction in EUI. It simply needs to reach the property type standard. So I'm going to give an example of that. So if an office building has an average Energy Star score, if office buildings in DC have their median score in Energy Star is 65, and a building that's an office building within DC has an Energy Star score of 64, then instead of needing to reach a 20% reduction in EUI, they simply need to hit that Energy Star score for their property type. So I'm happy to answer questions if there are any. That one's a little confusing, but more or less the idea behind it is that for already high performing buildings, it's really difficult to achieve additional energy savings. And we already mentioned that during the call today. So this was designed to help those higher performing building types. And then the prescriptive pathway is just an action-based pathway, and it's broken into 4 phases that phase in throughout that cycle. And really, it's an energy audit, designing an operations and maintenance program, developing an energy efficiency measure package, installing and implementing, and then evaluating performance. Next slide, please. So the New York law for benchmarking is called Local Law 97. They use the same metric as Boston, which is greenhouse gas intensity. It's calculated in the same way. Their law has 2 definitions of covered buildings. So for the core law, it covers commercial and multifamily buildings over 25,000 square feet. For the second sort of portion of the law, Multifamily, in the definition for covered buildings for this part, is multifamily affordable housing with 35% or more of the units subject to rent regulations. And if your building falls into that definition, you have a separate list of energy conservation measures. That's a prescriptive list that you have to accomplish. You can see the overarching target on the slide. So for the first part of the law, commercial multifamily greater than 25,000 square feet, and any energy efficiency measure combined with renewable energy can be used to reach the target. But for the multifamily affordable housing pathway, either the building must meet the greenhouse gas intensity limit, or they have to do a full list of energy conservation measures. And if you flip to the next slide, this is the full list of those measures. I'll leave it up for a second so you guys can see it, but they include things such as adjusting temperature set points in a building, preventative maintenance on your HVAC systems, insulating hot water pipes, weatherization and air sealing, and all that sort of good stuff. And then there's one more slide, or I guess two more. The last program we wanted to cover is Denver, Energize Denver. And so the metric for the Energize Denver program is weather normalized site EUI. The targets are set by 2030, and we've talked about this a lot today, and there's interim targets for 2024 and in 2027. It covers commercial and multifamily greater than 25,000 square feet. And energy efficiency is the primary compliance pathway to achieve the target EUI. There is an alternative compliance path for using electrification that's allowed for one subset of buildings, 25 to 100,000 square feet. And Katrina, please jump in if I misstated anything there.
I'll let you finish.
Oh, no, this is all I had for this slide, so please go for it.
Just a couple key corrections. There isn't a 2050 target. It is an overall 30% by 2030 target only. And there are a number of alternate compliance pathways, including solar power, offsetting EUI, adjusting a final target, adjusting an interim target, in addition to an electrification path for those smaller buildings. So there's a bunch of alternate compliance options that I would say are key to note.
No, thanks, Katrina. That's super helpful. I was having a difficult time sort of finding some of that information, and I should have reached out to you before this meeting, but maybe I can connect with you between this meeting and the next to make sure I've got all of that noted. Awesome. So one last slide. I just wanted to pull everything together in a summary for you guys. So quickly again, Boston and New York both use greenhouse gas intensity as their key metric. Boston doesn't really prescribe energy efficiency compliance options, but they sort of list the ones that you can see there as the ones that are available to folks. They do have an alternative compliance path outside of energy efficiency, which is renewable energy. For Denver, I'm going to just restate that energy efficiency is the primary compliance pathway, and that there are alternative pathways that I will learn more about from Katrina. New York City, greenhouse gas intensity is the key metric. Energy efficiency in New York can be combined with renewable energy to reach the target, but for those multifamily affordable housing units, if they cannot reach the target, they have the prescriptive list of energy conservation measures. In Washington, weather normalized site EUI is the standard, and the program's still being developed, but an energy audit and investing in energy efficiency measures are going to be included in the law. And then finally, DC uses Energy Star score. They have multiple compliance pathways, including one that allows additional flexibility for high performing buildings. And DC is important to note that they don't have any alternative compliance pathways outside of energy efficiency, because that's really the primary goal of their building performance standard. So I'll leave it at that. And if there are questions, happy to take them.
I wanted to jump in there. I'm curious, for those jurisdictions that have energy audit retro commission requirements, who administers that? Is that the city or is that the utility?
That's a good question, Kirk, and I will have to follow up on that.
I can answer this from a more national perspective, at least coming from the Midwest. Sometimes it's building departments who actually administer that in collaboration with the city. It depends what state or city you're looking at, though.
Yeah, we can dig into that and add that to the summary table as well from what we can find. Great. Well, like we said, that was a quick breeze through, so we don't expect you to. Thank you, Kim. Really appreciate it. That was a lot of digging. Not a lot of these communities have like very clear outlines of this. So thank you, Kim, for bringing that to the group. So we will obviously be sending these out to you all prior, and we can add links. Like it looks like Katrina sent a link, so we can send links as well if you want to dive deeper into some of these compliance pathways. But some things to be thinking about between this meeting and next meeting is obviously we'll share the PowerPoint, we'll share meeting notes so that you'll get all this data that we shared with you today in one space. And some things to think about is obviously knowing that the BPS compliance pathways that Kim just presented, you know, these different communities have different metrics and goals and different building makeups, but we'll be discussing at the next meeting what this group likes and does not like about these approaches. And then we'll tailor that and dive deeper into what would make sense for Colorado. So some things to be thinking about between meetings is those pieces. What do you like about each of these? What might not work here in Colorado, things like that. And we'll dive a lot deeper in the next meeting and hopefully choose some portions of that work well for Colorado. Another thing that we wanted to bring up is we also developed that working recommendations document. So we'll send that out now that we confirmed the guiding goals. We'll send that out to finalize those with everybody in this task force as well. And finally, we just wanted to bring up a little bit about Monday.com and just understanding the purpose there. And we wanted to just share an example of what Monday.com is not used for, and it's not for asking other people's opinions or thoughts on something. It's really a resource sharing. If you have questions specific to consultants or the state, we can answer those, but avoid kind of saying, I agree with you, or I don't think that works, or things like that within Monday.com. Just that those discussions will be held in this platform. Great. That was a lot of information, and it was 2.5 hours of your day. So we really, really appreciate it. We will follow up with all the information and continue conversations before we meet again in a month. And thank you all for your time, and thank you to presenters for getting all that information to the task force. We'll stay on for a few more minutes if anybody has any questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.